Hey, so I've been meaning to record more videos. The only problem with recording on StreamYard is one, my internet quality isn't best. So I get a little bit more lag. So I'm trying to talk a little bit more slower, switch between screens a little less. Also, the temptation to go live and like talk to people is really strong because that's what I enjoy the most. But I've got this one set to private, so it's just going to be me and you, dear viewer. If I get any viewers. If not, hey, just me. Cool. I have a long list of videos I want to make. I don't want to be one of those. I don't want to just produce videos every day and every week. Well, I do. I love streaming. And I love talking to you all, but like I'm trying to make them questions I get a lot. The ones I'm proud of, how to find wide receiver breakouts, or what is college dominator and breakout age, because they're things that are fair questions and they've got set answers and you can roll out the information and they're rewatchable kind of evergreen stuff. And that's what I try to make YouTube videos on. Also, hopefully I've gotten a little bit better at making them less just dried nerd stuff and more fun fantasy content. but hey, you be the judge. I've been talking for 2 minutes and so far nothing interesting's happened. But one I want to get to is, hey, do you like the new overlay? No, just kidding. What predicts fantasy points? I get requests pretty much daily for making some kind of super metric using these metrics to make this number, and it will be like super this, or and essentially what you're doing at that point is talking about creating a model, which everyone's doing and I make a lot of. But if we're using stats and combining them to predict or project or explain, and that's just modeling. And the first place you have to start is I really wonder what would happen if we combine slot rate. I mean, that's all interesting, but the research starts at what does slot rate or yards after catch percentage tell you? And not much, frankly, about the next year or the previous season or about the player themselves. Like, start at the beginning, work forward to it. So making super metrics. One, I'm not into making metrics a lot. I use a lot of modeling to try and understand what it can tell me and what that actually means. When you know what things can tell you, what it actually means when you put it all together. I've got a points per game model I'm going to mention for 2020. I think I can improve it, but it's already pretty good. But how do you know something's pretty good? That's all part of starting from the beginning. What tells you what and how much of it does it tell you is the place you have to start. So if you don't know that, pretty much you're just doing the tape equivalent of watching YouTube highlights by just jamming metrics together until it gives you a good R-squared score of whatever you're looking at. But it does kind of start with that. What correlates, what explains the variance in other stats? So what I posted on Twitter, and I've got a link to it in the description below as well, is a table that literally maps out what stats in one year tell you about stats in the next year, specifically for wide receivers who have played more than 8 games in both years. And I'm going to get a lot nerdier at the end of this and tell you, because I get questions on like, how do I do that? And I'll show you literally the process I go through quickly, because again, StreamYard, laggy, and also screen sharing a massive spreadsheet isn't fun. But I will tell you what I do and basically how to do that. I'm going to save it for the end because the information, I think, is what most people are interested in. So first off is what does anything tell us? And so let me, I created this post. Sorry, got a little lag there. What predicts fantasy points in year 2? The link again is in the description, so you can go straight to it. It's free. My Patreon's free, guys. I'm looking for support, all the support I can get, because money pays for stuff. But like, I'm doing this for fun. It's not a go here and give me money for this table thing. Nothing like that. You can go, you can read through it. You can even, I think in that one, there's a link straight to the data. There's a table of contents so you understand what all the metrics are. But essentially all that's going on in this table here is across the top, you have the stats for the next year, N+1 or Y+1 or whatever you want to call it. How the stats that they got in their second season, if they played 8 games and they played 8 games the year before that. And along the left, you've got the stats that they scored in that year. So essentially what you're looking at is a map of how much it tells you about what they're going to do the next season, literally. Just for wide receivers who played 8 games since 2009, because I'm using air yards. So you can't see it. The resolution and the size of this thing is just never going to work out well on a stream. But let me read through some stuff. If you look at the top left there, well, if you could look at the top left, or you followed through to the post, so you can actually see the table. The top left stat is total EP. And if you look at the, if you just check out the, what do you call it? Table of contents, lexicon, I don't know, the list of what all these abbreviations mean. EP is expected points. It's a model created by RotoViz telling you how many fantasy points a player could have expected with the volume that he got if he was an average player, right? So that on the left there, it's mapping total expected points from year end, when they played 8 games, to what they did in the next year, N+1. It's actually N exclamation mark, so it's a little heavy on the old shift key there, but it's N+1. Okay, and what we see is that total expected points from year 1 predicts how many total expected points they're going to get the next year by about not predicts, but explains the variance in those stats by about 0.4, or if you just like to use a percentage, which I do, 40%. Explains 40% of the variance. Is 40% good? Actually, yes. Once you look over how predictive stats are from one year to the next in a decent sample size, like players that played 8 games in both, what you find is 40% is actually a pretty high correlation. Now, that should also tell you that explaining 40% of the variance sounds pretty bad, and it is pretty bad. This is some horror we're talking about with NFL stats. Small sample sizes, way too many variables going on for any single stat to predict even itself the next year very well. And if you look at efficiency stats, like expected points is a volume stat, but let's go to like yards per reception, REYPR, receiving yards per reception. That's just the way RotoViz abbreviates it. It's about halfway down the list. So receiving points, yards per reception predicts itself, and remember that's an efficiency metric, about 0.15. So about 15% of the variance, the change in yards per reception from a player's first year to the second year, any year they played, year 1 to year 2, and we can explain about 15% of their yards per reception just using yards per reception. So 40% sounding much better, right? Efficiency stats suck at predicting anything, especially predicting themselves. Volume stats win. That's why we're always highlighting players that get volume, because volume typically predicts more volume or the same volume at a much better rate than efficiency predicts more efficiency the next season. If you see what I mean, that's why volume is king. All right. Now, because of the way the table is set out, I've highlighted the diagonal boxes running left to right, right? And that's simply because, those are the boxes where the stat is projecting itself. So expected points, top left, 40%. Whereas on the bottom, I know that sounds very English, bottom, I sound bottom, very English, but market share of Whopper. So the percentage of teams Whopper or weighted opportunity rating, which is an air yards metric and a really, really good one, which this table shows us along with everything else, predicts more market share of Whopper, or explains 51%. 51% of the variance in the market share of Whopper is explained by market share of Whopper they got the year before. And so that's what the diagonal box is about. However, we're normally just interested in fantasy points. And now if you're interested in projections or understanding a little bit more, then you're interested in how much each of these stats project themselves. And that also shows where volume is king. But really, the main crux is we want fantasy points. So what tells us the most about how many fantasy points a player is going to score the next season? And that column is the third column along, and I've got it highlighted in a separate box. So all of those results there tell you how much these stats tell you about their fantasy points per game the next season. The king, fantasy points per game. Points per game predict points per game the next season more than any other single stat. The next closest is expected points at 37%, or receiving expected points, and since the wide receivers, that is exactly the same result. Total expected points is adding rushing and receiving together, which is more relevant for running back than it is for wide receiver. So expected points wins. However, air yards like Whopper, market share of Whopper, or just market share of air yards, the percentage of air yards they got, or just plain air yards, also all go over or at 30% or above, which, as we mentioned, was this range of results from 0 to 40. 40 is one of our best. Actually, 54 is actually the best result I found in here, and that's Whopper predicting Whopper the next season. Whopper's a really good stat. Weighted opportunity rating, again, to explain that acronym, which is just weighting their target share by their market share of air yards. So it's already not a model, it's a different stat. But what we want to do to create more predictable points per game is combine the ones that have the best explanation for fantasy points the next season and themselves to project it the next season. So that's what this table does. It tells you exactly how much stats tell you the next year. And a good result, the best result, is like 54%, just over half of the variance explained, right? And that's in a sample size where all players played 8 games both seasons. You could limit to touches, you could limit any way you want. I just went simple games. Since we're looking at points per game stat, I wanted to adjust for games played a little bit more than I wanted to adjust for touches. And just see raw information. Now, you'll see slightly different results. A lot of people do this. I got the idea to do this from Scott Barrett, at Scott Barrett, on Twitter. I think he writes Fantasy Points now, fantasypoints.com. Brilliant mind. Really good fantasy player, and I thought that's information I want to be able to track, and I want to know what tells me about what the next year, especially if you want to create models or projections or anything else. So that's what this table does, and I've already put it up there for free. You can go look and see what are the best stats. That's where you start. What's telling me the most? And remember, if it's just telling you 13, 14, even 20% of what happens the next year, it's pretty much useless to tell you about that stat the next year. And most things are pretty much useless, which is why we end up rolling out the same old arguments about volume and who got more volume than you'd expect, and adjusting for career year and age, because that age also seems to play a role, and so does career year. And that's why we must stick to volume when we're nerding out on stats for fantasy players, because it tells us the most about what's more likely to happen, and it still tells us, on average, less than 50% of what's most likely to happen. So what can we do with this stuff if we combine the best? I'm not going to bore you too much about talking about this table, so let me bore you about talking about this one. This, again, is in the description. It's a link straight to it, and yeah, it's free. You can follow it. You can even go, and I know with this one, you can go straight to the spreadsheet, see all the data. You can make a copy of your own and play with it yourself. All the stats are in there since 2009, as well as my points per game results. So what I did with this information is combine some of the best stats. Now, at the time, I didn't have air yards. I just recently managed to get air yards back into my main NFL database, which is also something I just posted on Twitter. So if you want, on Patreon and then on Twitter. So if you want my NFL database, that link's on Patreon too, and you can go get all the stats since 2000. And I just combined air yards in. I didn't at the time. All I had was every other stat, but not air yards. But air yards being one of the most predictive means I want to redo my points per game model, and I want to try to include Whopper, especially weighted opportunity rating. But what I had at the time was age. Age seems to play a marginal role here. Okay, the reason all dynasty players talk about it is it does have signal. It is useful. I had career year, but age worked out the best when I was testing probability values. Again, watch my video on how to make a model if you want to understand a little bit more about that. But even in that video, I tell you need to learn a lot more about it, because I'm actually not a statistician. Again, warning, I'm just an amateurist here, okay, trying to understand the best of what the smart guys say to try and apply it and use it for myself. And what I found the most useful was target market share, so the percentage of targets in a season per game. So you divide it by the games they played. So that adjusts for someone like Devontae Adams last year, for example, who was phenomenal but played less games. Also, yards per team pass attempt got into the model, high probability of having a likelihood of effect on the results, and also a significant R squared to what happens the next season if you check the table out. I also included points per game as the most predictive stat of what points per game I'm going to have the next season. And then I combined all of those in a model to project points per game the next season. Now, the correlation when I back tested this, and I didn't do an out of sample testing, to be fair, I forgot. But if I just tested all seasons 2008 to 2009, it projected fantasy points the next season at a 57% rate. So it beats any singular stat, but you're still looking at, I can get it up with the right sample to around 60% of the variance, okay? So it's still not ironclad, this is what's going to happen, but it is the best I can do to understand what's the most likely based on where they are in their career and the volume they had last season and the value of that volume with yards per team pass attempt, hoping to switch that out for Whopper, will do. And if you want to see the results, again, they're all there. Interesting enough, DJ Chark is one of the really came out really well in that model. And so I've started to target, despite my dislike of his college profile, I started to target DJ Chark a little bit more. He looks like a significant value going into 2020. But again, 60% bet, I'll take it, but I'm not going to bury the farm for a player who I didn't like coming out of college, but he should have been higher than why I had him before, and that's one of the things this thing taught me. So understanding what stats tell you about the next season is where you start. Then you try and combine the value of them to try and find odd things. And in that case, that specific case, like DJ Chark popped up, but so did like Michael Thomas. Chris Godwin is really high, and I expect him to reduce. Actually, his volume was low, but his yards per team pass attempt was high, which speaks to the efficiency on that volume. We know efficiency is less predictive, so I don't like him being heavily weighted on that. But obviously, everyone likes Chris Godwin, and so did the model, to be fair. And Mike Evans rose significantly as well, surprisingly. It made relatively little adjustments to the points per game last season, because points per game is the most relevant. But it did adjust, and where it adjusted based on what they did last season, I think is the most important point. So it's not even the overall ranking, although it does highlight some players. It's who did it adjust down the most and up the most that I found most interesting while diving into my points per game model. But outside of that, I do think it's this is probably the best points per game projection using these year-over-year stats that we can get, or I can get out of it. Scott Barrett's got a better one, I'm sure. Jacob Ricker or JJ Zacharias, and they could all do a better job with this. I'm just a grinder, right? But I'm trying to take all the stuff those smart guys say and apply it to me, so I don't, have to hope they mention it again this year on their podcast. Now we can track it ourselves and maybe do something that we prefer. But it starts with what predicts what and how much, not which stat do I like, which stat do I think has an effect. Like, let's find out. And that all starts with what does anything tell us about anything else, which is this. It doesn't have all stats in it. It's not, like I said, you could play with a sample size yourself using my NFL database and create your own, which I guess gets me to, how did I make it? So, okay, that's the content. If you're not a severe nerd, that's time to check out if you haven't already after 18 minutes. All right. Real quick, because, again, this isn't the perfect format to do this in. I think I'd rather do it in a live stream with probably OSB, because I can do a little bit more with my screen than I can in StreamYard. But essentially what I do is from the NFL database, I copy and paste all wide receivers' stats all across the top here and all the wide receivers across the bottom. Then I sorted them. And I did a very simple formula using a helper column. Now, a helper column, all that is whether you've got an ID in there, which I do, or a player name, you just do player name plus year, okay? And then push it down the row. And so next to every player name, you've got player name and year, right? So then when you search for something, you can use that player column to look for that player's stats in a specific year. And that's what I did. And again, I've got how-to videos on how to combine player name and stats using the ampersand or the and sign on my how-to Excel sheet. If none of that makes sense, like short, sharp 5-minute videos. This stuff's really easy. You just haven't Googled it yet. But here's an example of me doing it with NFL stats. All right. So I looked at all these stats that I had for the players year 2. So whatever season it was, in this case, the top line is Brandon Marshall in 2012. And then once I ran the little index match formula, again, you can look up how to do that on my how-to videos across all these stats. Now I know that he played 15 games in 2013, and I have it lined up. And the important thing here is to get their year 1 and year N+1 lined up next to each other, because we're just using Excel and doing this simply. After that, I sorted the column on the left side by games played, and I delete everyone who didn't play 8 games in that season. And then I sort again by the year 2 stats and deleted all the lines where players didn't play 8 games in their second season. I also had to eliminate some players that didn't have air yards metrics because they just weren't in the air yards database. It worked out to about a sample of 819 players since 2009 who played 8 games year 1 and year 2. And those years change, obviously, since it's a large sample. Then all I did is made the table, formatted it, and you use a simple RSQ formula, which finds R squared with variable 1 and variable 2. Again, there's a how-to if that doesn't make sense to you. And you just line it up. You say this is variable 1 in year 1, and this is variable 2 in year 2. Find it for me. And what I do is actually I do that, and I lock. Again, locking the column is a how-to video. Lock the first variable, so year 1's variable. And I do that for all the first columns. So all these columns here. So all their stats, specifically trying to predict receiving targets, because that's the first metric I was trying to predict. This one, I wasn't trying to predict games. And then all I did is highlight the columns and drag them across. And it continues to run those formulas, and because I locked the first column, it's now trying to predict receiving targets against opportunities or touches the next season, because that's the very next column in the data set. It's a really simple process. It was pretty processor heavy, just to let you know. Like my little laptop really struggled with it. It took a few seconds before it popped them up, and I crashed a few times. Because you're running a lot of complex calculations over a large table. But it caught up eventually, and then I had a table. Then I normalized the numbers into actual numbers instead of formulas. No, I don't want to save that. And I had it. And then it just depends which. I had to go back and do it a few more times because I wanted more columns. I wanted Whopper in there, for example, and then I wanted yards per team pass attempts. I had to do it all again. But that's all I do. I line up variables in year 1. Use an index match search with a helper column and to find and look up all the variables in year 2, delete everyone that doesn't have data or cross my threshold for sample size, which in this case was everyone playing 8 games in both seasons, and then built the table and asked Excel to run the R-squared formula on all of them. It's actually remarkably simple, as you'd expect for a grinder. All I did is put in the legwork. There's nothing you can understand. And again, if you got to this point and you're like, well, I'm not a nerd, but I'll listen. And now you're like, that made no sense to me. It's all really simple. Like the way I work in Excel is as simple as possible. Like R squared, it's just a formula. I don't actually know how to calculate R squared. It's a really complicated mathematical principle that I've taken time to try and understand what it's doing. But I'm not going to tell you I could write out the mathematical equation. Fortunately, Excel has a function where you type equals RS squared, enter the 2 variables you want to perform the equation on, and Excel does it. That I'm not a mathematician, and I'm definitely not a statistician, but fortunately there are tools out there to help a grinder just try and understand it a little better themselves, and that's what I'm up to. So I hope you enjoyed the video, 24-minute video. Clearly, I'm not a great YouTuber. It's not 10 minutes, and it has no ads in it. So this is like unlike any YouTube video you watch at all. But hopefully some of it was interesting. If you have any questions, problems, you want to do it yourself, and you don't know where to get the data, because in the description or something, just let me know. Hit me up on Twitter at Pahowdy. Comment on the video below. Happy to talk to you about nerdy type stuff, or not, for that matter, if you just want to talk about, how great Mike Evans is or something. Really appreciate you checking it out, especially if you stuck through it for 25 minutes. Thanks again, and I will talk to you again next time I come up with a subject, honestly.